Domo domo, what is up everybody? Official Jujutsu Kaisen translator Steady here. We are here today for a kind of a special video actually. So we've finally reached Jujutsu Kaisen's Shibuya incident, part 40, which would be chapter 122. And I thought it a good time to kind of have a little checkpoint. To be honest, I don't know how much longer it's going to go on. You know, it's certainly seems that we'll have at least maybe, I don't know, at least 10 more chapters or so, in my opinion. Whether the naming part so-and-so will change along the way, who knows? Maybe it'll go on for a lot longer. Certainly chapter 40 kind of brings us to a little bit of a checkpoint, and the nature of the Shibuya incident has us kind of going back and forth a little bit between fights, between locations in Shibuya, and times obviously as well, right? I will say Shibuya itself is actually quite small, physically speaking. I think people would be quite surprised how small it actually is. So everything is happening quite close to each other. That said, there is a lot going on. You know, you read the first 10 parts, 15 parts, and you're like, okay, I'm following along. But now we're at part 40. It's gotten quite the task to make these mental notes. So I did kind of more and more for myself to just kind of make a kind of a mental, not just mental, but like physically understand where we're at and what happened before what and this and that. But I put together this timeline here, which I thought I'd share, you know, with the fans out there, spread that positive juju, so to speak. So, you know, not just on Twitter, but make a little bit of a video out of it as well. Why not? Certainly, this video might be me kind of talking, not really ranting. I'll try to keep the ranting, the deviating to a minimum, but I thought we just kind of go through. I've got the Arasaka gear going on right here, and I've got a little bit of a drink for myself as well. Also Arasaka from Cyberpunk 2077, very excited about it. So here we go, a little bit of a Jujutsu Kaisen Shibuya incident timeline as of part 40. Here we go. Alright, so I will just say a little bit of a disclaimer there. A lot of these kind of events, as I'm sure you've noticed reading the chapters, they don't have a timestamp for every single thing that's going on, nor should we really expect that. So anything you see during this timeline that I'm about to show you that has a little asterisk next to the time is kind of my estimation, just kind of based on what it's falling after, how it should make sense in terms of events that follow it or precede it. But the very first thing that we need to mention is that in chapter 83, which was part 1, we get that little panel saying a 400 meter radius curtain cast with Tokyo department store Toyoko branch at the center. So Tokyo department store, I mean, it's you know, it's kind of I don't know if department store is a little bit different in maybe in Japan than other places, but yeah, just kind of like a little shopping building, right? So very much smack dab in the middle of Shibuya. So that happened at 7 p.m. But then kind of where the action starts is on chapter 83 at 8:14 p.m. This is where we get that little flow of the different teams. We get the Nanami team, Zenin team, and the Kusakabe team kind of introduced, and we have Ijichi kind of explaining to them the situation, right? And they are at their respective locations. The next big event that does happen after that would be at 8:31 p.m., also chapter 83, is when Satoru Gojo arrives. When we have that little panel of him kind of entering the curtain. Satoru Gojo is on the scene, right? And then shortly after at 8:38, 7 minutes after that little Satoru Gojo arrives is when we see Gojo actually enter Hikarie Shinkyu, which is also another kind of a building in Shibuya for kind of shopping purposes. But it also does lead down to the subway as well. And, you know, we saw all these, all the people that were there kind of drawn downstairs and packing this kind of lobby area. And they're all, you know, it's Halloween, so they're all dressed up in that, right? And then immediately after that at 8:39 is when we kind of flash over to the Mei team. Of course, we have Mei, her younger brother Ui, as well as, you know, our very own MC, Yuji Itadori, at Aoyama Cemetery, which is a little bit further north. So you have Shibuya, then you have north is Harajuku, and then just north of that is Aoyama Cemetery. Again, Harajuku and Shibuya are very close. It's basically a train stop away, which we will explore later on in this video as well. Again, I want to emphasize that everything is pretty close. I think people are really surprised when they see how small Tokyo actually is, like Tokyo proper anyways. But then immediately after that, we have at 8:40, roughly 2 minutes, not roughly, exactly 2 minutes after Gojo enters Hikarie Shinkyu's, he goes even further down to B5F, where the Tokyo Metro is, where Gojo confronts Jogo, Hanami, and Choso, and their little fight, if you can call it that, begins. So that is at 8:40 p.m. And then 11 minutes later at 8:51 p.m., chapter 85 is, I forgot to mention before as well, when we saw the Mei team, remember they were called to go over to the Meiji Jingu Maya station, which is Harajuku. It takes them roughly 10 minutes to get from Aoyama to Meiji Jingu Maya station, which is at 8:51 p.m. in chapter 85. And then in chapter 86, at 9:03 p.m. is when Yuji enters Meiji Jingu Maya station by himself. Remember, they kind of are at the street level, looking at the entrance to go into Meiji Jingu Maya station, and he's talking to Mei saying like, "Is the patch face down there?" Because remember, Mei sends her crows down and does a little bit of scouting, and she talks about how she sees all these transfigured humans. So that's why Yuji's like, then he's down there, I'm going down there. And then Mei is like, okay, you go do your thing. And that is when the fight against the grasshopper guy starts as well, right? So the grasshopper, again, all these fights are actually quite short. You know, and that's a realistic aspect about Jujutsu Kaisen fights. You know, they don't go on for hours and this and that. Usually they're over in just a couple minutes, which is quite realistic in terms of the kind of the powers and all that in Jujutsu Kaisen. You know, you have fights like in Dragon Ball or Bleach or whatever, those might be going on for a long time, but that's kind of a different tier, right? So at 9:14 in chapter 87 is when we see Mahito entering the train from Meiji Jingu Maya, so where Yuji and them are. So he indeed was at that station, but he kind of slips out of the Mei team's hands and heads over to Meiji Jingu Maya station, of course, with the train full of transfigured humans, right? Remember, we see at 9:15 Mei team heading down to B5F of Meiji Jingu Maya station, and Mahito arrives at Shibuya with a train full of transfigured humans around the same time. So they just missed him. And again, this is what I mean, is that Harajuku and Shibuya station are very close. So even if Mahito did enter the train at Harajuku station at 9:14, it literally would take just about a minute to get to Shibuya station, which is where Gojo is having his fight, of course, with Jogo and Hanami and Choso. And that is indeed our next event at 9:17 p.m. in chapter 89. Of course, a very iconic moment now. Gojo uses his unlimited void domain expansion versus the special grade cursed spirits, and he annihilates roughly 1,000 transfigured humans in 299 seconds. That's 4 minutes and 59 seconds. He manages to kind of contain the situation there, even with Mahito and the train full of transfigured humans. And then that is roughly at 9:17 p.m. because if we're to assume that Mahito got to the station around 9:15, the fight would have only really, remember, Gojo pretty much used it immediately, so it's within a couple minutes that he used his domain expansion. But then at 9:22 p.m. in chapter 92 is when we get that little page showing that the three teams enter the battle, so to speak. The three teams being Nanami team, the Zenin team, as well as the Sakabe team, right? Although, and then the next event, now this is kind of an estimate time, should be pretty accurate based on what happens afterwards. At 9:24 p.m. On chapter 90, this is of course the iconic moment immediately after Gojo uses his domain expansion, is when the fake Geto, or we didn't know at that time, but the reveal happens, right? So he reveals himself as a fake Geto, and then he uses Prism Realm immediately, and then Gojo is indeed sealed. But this is also at the same time Mekamaru, the little disc Mekamaru, is contacting the Meimei team right around the same time, and then immediately after we see the kind of curse user come from down the train tracks with the kind of like dog curse, it almost looks like, which we later find out Meimei pretty much polishes them off pretty quick, right? So if we're to assume that the Prism Realm sealing of Gojo happens at roughly 9:24 p.m., we do get a time stamp at 9:26 is when the fake Geto group is kind of looking at the prison realm and they can't move him. Remember, we see it, and then we see Gojo kind of just chilling out inside, and then we see them kind of like, okay, well, what do we do now? And this is where we move immediately after. A minute later is when Yuji is now on street level, and he yells out, Gojo was sealed, just to the whole kind of town, right? But he does say, Nanamin, Gojo was sealed. This is after, of course, Mekamaru tells him that Gojo was indeed sealed. So they get that intel. And this is also the same time when Ijichi gets stabbed as well. Remember, he was kind of on the bridge on phone duty, and then he gets stabbed from behind by a ponytail guy, which we now know his name is Haruta Shigemo, or was Haruta Shigemo, I guess, because Sukuna, of course, took care of him. And then, so as Yuji is yelling this out, we can also assume that around the same time at 9:27 p.m., the special grade curses decide to split up from fake Geto. Now, this is, at the time, it was almost as though, you know, they split up from fake Geto, but it almost as though it seemed that they just kind of went out on their own. Remember, they were talking about how they have their own plans. Mahito wanted to kill Yuji. Jogo wanted to revive Sukuna then and there as soon as possible. Choso was like, I'm out of here, I'm done. But we eventually see him run into Yuji, so they have that fight. But so they were all kind of ready to do their own thing. But we find out in the most recent chapter, chapter 122, that they did regroup at the top of the stairs, it would seem, away from the fake Geto. Now, this could or could not be an interesting point, because it could mean that they do discuss something, you know, without the prying eyes and ears of fake Geto, or it could just be kind of overthinking it. But It's certainly possible because, you know, Fate Geto has his own agenda. The special grade curses have their own agenda too. So there are things they are working together, but there are things that they are and aren't telling each other, right? And of course, we know Uraume, the white-haired monk, has their own agenda as well. But then at 9:30, we get a exact timestamp revealing that the special grade curses group up again at B4F immediately after splitting up from Fate Geto. Dagon slurps up a bunch of humans, and Mahito splits into two. And one heads downstairs and the other to street level. So even though this is in the most recent chapter, we have to keep in mind that this is happening at 9:30, which would be right after they split up from Fate Geto, and this is when Gojo was sealed, so immediately thereafter, pretty much within a couple minutes. And then the next big event would be at 9:40. We get a timestamp is when Nobara and the manager Nita engage Shigemo, or they run into Shigemo, basically the side ponytail, and that's when their kind of fight starts. And then at 9:44 in chapter 98 as well, we also get a timestamp of Nanami looking down at the kind of stab body of Ijichi, and of course he's all right. No more Mr. Nice Guy, which we get in chapter 100. This is now this is kind of where it's a little bit wishy-washy. I put it down as 9:48 p.m. and although that's only within, you know, 4 or 5 minutes of Nanami actually locating Ijichi, and remember, we have to understand that Nanami most likely brought Ijichi to Shoko and Principal Yaga to get him healed and then go find Nobara and them. So the math is like, okay, so he dropped off Yujichi and then got to Nobara and Nita that quickly. And I have to say that it is roughly around that time, as fast as that sounds, because Nanami finds Ijichi 4 minutes after Nobara and Nita engage Shigemo, right? And that's a 4-minute difference. Nobara and Nita couldn't have been fighting Shigemo for much more than, I would say, 8 to 10 minutes or so before Nanami finds them. Remember, they're kind of on the street, and then they make their way into the building, and they're kind of got their backs to the wall. But it couldn't have been too long because, again, like I mentioned before, fights in Jujutsu Kaisen don't last that long. I can't see Nobara and Nita having been engaging Shigemo, the side ponytail guy, for much more than 8 to 10 minutes or so before Nanami gets to the scene. Sorry, I know that was a little bit confusing, but hopefully that makes sense. We have a little bit of a gap here because the next kind of big timestamp would be at 10:01 p.m., which is chapter 94. Again, we're kind of flashing back a little bit. The Ino team engage Awasaka team at the Shibuya S Tower. Remember, we have Awasaka, the inverse guy, as well as Granny Ogami at the top of the tower. And then we see Nue, boom, and then we see Ino now with Yuji and Fushiguro kind of engaging them. And then roughly 2 minutes later, I would say at 10:03 p.m. is when Toji is summoned by Granny Ogami. Because at 10:04 p.m. is when we get a timestamp that Fushidori, Fushiguro, and Itadori defeat Awasaka, and that is when Ino is thrown off the building. Of course, as soon as Toji is summoned, he pretty much takes care of Ino right away and throws him off the building. So this 10:01, so this fight between the Fushidori pair and Awasaka probably didn't last for much more than just a few minutes. It has to be anyways, because we get that timestamp of 10:01 p.m. is when they engage, and 10:04 p.m. we get another timestamp showing Awasaka tied up and out of commission. Again, so kind of reinforcing the fact that these fights happen quick. But at the same time, we get a timestamp at 10:02 p.m. showing Mei Mei finishing off that curse user. So this is actually, Mei Mei was with that curse user for quite a while. Yeah, so roughly at 9:24 p.m. is when we have Mekamaru contacting the Mei Mei team, and then the fight against this curse user happens. So although this is kind of a point where it's a little bit wishy-washy, like Mei Mei was really fighting this guy for half an hour, but that's the timestamp that we get. So yeah, I guess so. Maybe she was just toying with him. So, but immediately after Mei Mei finishes off the curse user, remember we have Fake Geto come out, and this is when he summons the smallpox deity. So roughly at 10:05 p.m. In chapter 101 is when we get the Mei Mei versus smallpox deity fight starting. This is also roughly around the same time that Yuji runs into Toge Inumaki, of course, second year of Tokyo Jutsu High. And then he enters Shibuya Station immediately after, and immediately after entering the station is when his fight against Choso starts. So this Mei Mei versus smallpox deity fight is happening right around the same time as Yuji fighting Choso. But again, Mei Mei doesn't have too much trouble against the smallpox deity, and roughly 10 minutes later at 10:15 p.m. is when the Mei Mei versus Fake Geto fight starts. And that was back in chapter 102, so we haven't heard anything from them in 20 chapters basically, and this is kind of a big, this is a huge point. This is kind of why, a big part of why I even did this timeline, because I was curious. I kept on, when I've been reading the recent chapters, I was thinking to myself, what happened to Mei Mei versus Geto? Like, when even was that? So kind of looking back on it now and getting a timestamp on it, where we are right now in chapter 122 with Yuji fighting against Mahito and Nobara fighting against the clone Mahito, this would be like an hour ago. So the fight should very well be done. So, and it's kind of mysterious, the fact that we haven't seen it for a long time. Obviously, the Fake Geto being a big key to this whole Shibuya incident, so we don't know what's going on there. So this is something to really note, I would say. But then in chapter 106, we get a timestamp at 10:20 p.m. So roughly 5 minutes after the Mei Mei versus Fake Geto fight starts, we have Naobito, Maki, Nanami entering Shibuya Station. Remember, they kind of group up now. And then the fight versus Dagon starts. So the fight against Dagon is happening theoretically right around the Mei Mei versus Fake Geto fight, assuming that they are fighting. So it's kind of a point of interest for sure, because that is kind of a big mystery on, right, like I mentioned before, what's going on in Shibuya right now. And then again, this is kind of a rough estimate based on when the fight versus Dagon started. I would say roughly 10 minutes later is when Toji appears at Dagon's domain expansion, assuming that domain expansions don't really mess with time, even though we have seen that before. I'm going to assume here that roughly, it's only a few minutes into the fight against Dagon that Dagon uses the domain expansion, and I don't imagine it being too much longer after that before Toji appears inside the domain expansion. So roughly 10 minutes later is when we see Toji have his amazing entrance into Dagon's domain expansion. Roughly 5 to 6 minutes after Toji appears in Dagon's domain expansion, in chapter 111 is when we see Toji indeed defeating Dagon. And then immediately after defeating Dagon and then the domain expansion is gone, remember, he grabs Fushiguro and throws him right out onto the street and follows him outside. So the Toji versus Fushiguro fight happens roughly at around 10:36 p.m. And then again, pretty much as soon as Toji throws out Fushiguro onto the street and follows him, pretty much as soon as Fushiguro lands onto the street and that fight starts is when Jogo appears right next to Naobito and Nanami and them, right? Because they aren't even given a chance to follow Fushiguro out before we see Jogo, boom, right there. And Jogo, of course, makes quick work of the three, being Naobito, Nanami, and Maki. But then he also immediately feels Sukuna's presence right after he takes care of... Actually, if you look closely, Jogo was about to land kind of a second finishing off hit, as we call todome in Japanese, against Naobito, which makes me think that Naobito might be... Of course, he's in rough condition as well. He's missing an arm and he's burned up already, but he's not quite finished off in the same way that Nanami is. And of course, we don't know what's going on with Maki. That's also a scary part. But we see Jogo fly off to go find Sukuna. And then remember, assuming that the fight between Toji and Fushiguro starts at around 10:36 p.m. Again, this probably doesn't take too much time. A few minutes, 3-4 minutes. I would say later is when Toji ends up taking his own life, ending the rampage. And then right around the same time, again, this is an estimate. This is where it gets a little bit hard to tell what the time was, but I think it's close enough. Gives us an idea of what's going on. So as Toji is kind of killing himself, is when Jogo finds Yuji. Still not Sukuna, and the twins Nanako and Mimiko, which he takes care of really quickly, and then he feeds the 15 fingers to Yuji immediately after. And then so Sukuna is temporarily at least revived, and then this is also when immediately after Nanako and Mimiko are killed by Sukuna, right? At 10:51 is when we get a timestamp in chapter 113, where we get that little, for the first time, we are shown Principal Yaga and Shoko are indeed at Shibuya, but they're kind of in a corner, away from the action, of course, because we know how important Shoko is, and they're trying to keep the fact that Shoko is at Shibuya under wraps, because if any of the special grade curses were to find out that Shoko was there, they would go immediately after her. And if you look closely, we also see Ino and Ijichi under Shoko's care. So they are both okay. Well, okay, they're not dead. And then, so that's happening at 10:51 p.m. We're almost there. Thanks for sticking around. So roughly at 11 p.m. is when Fushiguro is cut from behind by Shigemo, the ponytail guy. At 11:01 p.m. in chapter 114 is when we finally see Kusakabe and Panda again. We haven't seen them for like 30 chapters at this point. We see them run into Geto's group, the blonde-haired girl, as well as the guy who kind of has the bandana and kind of covering one eye as well, right? But if we get that timestamp at 11:01, and kind of them bantering, and Kusakabe is trying to kill time, and it's just comedic genius. But immediately after, so right at around 11:02 p.m. is when we see the Sukuna versus Jogo fight spill out onto the street. We see the building explode, and Sukuna's like, "Is that all you got?" Right? We also get a timestamp at 11:05 p.m. a few minutes later, of Jogo dropping Maximum Meteor onto Shibuya, the big. And remember, Sukuna's confronts Kusakabe and them, don't move, all right, go. And then we also haven't seen Kusakabe and Panda since then, nor the blonde-haired chick as well as the bandana guy. So we can assume that they're okay, that they got away, but at the same time, at this point, we can assume a lot of things, and then Akutami Sensei will say, nope, too bad. So I'm not going to confirm that they're okay or whatever, because for all we know, they might not be. But immediately after Jogo drops Maximum Meteor, Jogo is pretty much killed immediately after by Sukuna, remember, by the kind of fire arrow looking thing. And then immediately followed up in chapter 116. So at roughly 11:06 p.m., Sukuna is approached by Uraume. And Uraume, we finally get a name for the white-haired monk. We haven't seen really much of Uraume besides them on the beach, which we now know was Dagon's domain. But kind of the big surprise here is not just a name reveal, but the fact that it seems that Uraume is very familiar with Sukuna, almost kind of a servant of Sukuna. So Uraume, for whatever reason, has made it to this timeline as well. So there's a lot we don't know about Uraume. But we can definitely assume that they know each other, and Sukuna pretty much hates everyone, but seems to be at least cordial with Uraume, which is interesting and says a lot about Uraume's character as well. Potentially that they are extremely powerful as well. But then we also get a timestamp at 11:07 p.m. in chapter 117 of the Mahoraga summon. So at 11:07 p.m. is also when Sukuna kind of senses Mahoraga's presence, and he rushes to the scene. And then the fight between Mahoraga and Sukuna starts, and that doesn't last too much longer either, because at 11:11 p.m. roughly is when Sukuna uses the 140 meter radius, roughly, Malevolent Shrine. Mahoraga is defeated, and of course Shigemo is cut, so he's out of luck, right? The timestamp that we get in chapter 120 is at 11:14 p.m., which shows Sukuna returning to Shibuya and turning back into Yuji. So we can assume that roughly 1 minute before, at 11:13 p.m., is when we see Sukuna dropping off Fushiguro, still alive, to Shoko and them, and then immediately rushing back into the center of town before he turns back into Yuji, which is marked at 11:14 p.m. Chapter 122, we see the Kugisaki versus Mahito fight beginning at Dogenzaka Alley. And then at 11:18 p.m. is unfortunately roughly around the time that Nanami gets killed, because at 11:19 p.m. in chapter 121 is when we get the timestamp that 11:19 Yuji versus Mahito are pinpointed at the Dogenzaka Ticket Gate, which is the most recent chapter, their fight low going on, right? But what's important to note here is that the Kugisaki versus Clone Mahito fight technically starts 3 minutes before we see Yuji use his manji kick versus Mahito. Of course, very significant because Mahito mentions towards the later in the chapter saying we're going to have a extra card in the hand, right? Another ace up the sleeve, referring to Kugisaki and them, which the fight has been going on for 3 minutes already, which could or could not end up being a big deal, that the fight could be over already. And of course, I don't want to think about what the worst could happen, but that's kind of where we leave off. Yeah, I know that was a lot. I'm sorry if I made it more confusing than it needed to be. I will have this timeline graph on my Twitter, which is at Steady Studios, which is also linked in the description. So feel free to kind of go back and look through this on your own time, which I'm sure will, then you can kind of, flip through the manga at the same time as well. But I definitely wanted to kind of give my insight in kind of some of the significant kind of timestamps as well. And yeah, kind of make a video out of it. It's always fun to talk about Jujutsu Kaisen. But yeah, hey, thank you so much. I know this was a little bit of a longer one, but thank you so much for sticking around for this one. Thank you very much for spreading that positive juju with a like and a comment and sharing. If other people that are enjoying the series and maybe are a little bit confused about what's going on in Shibuya Incident right now, feel free to share it with them. So thank you very much if you choose to do so. But hey, I've kept you around long enough. All I gotta say is cheers to you. You know how we do. Mata yoroshiku. Alright. See you next time.